Welcome back to the deep dive. We always try to unpack the big, complex ideas shaping our world, shaping current events, and really the fabric of American identity itself.
It's crucial, isn't it? Understanding those underlying worldviews is key.
Absolutely. And today we're taking a really fascinating journey, diving deep into how different perspectives see a really foundational period, the post-war liberal order.
That's right. And this isn't just, surface politics. We're talking about ideas built on some pretty deep philosophical roots.
Like what?
Well, things like Scottish and American moral philosophy, common sense realism, and really importantly for this discussion, classic American liberalism. There's principles sort of inform how these different frameworks see the world. They're the bedrock, really.
Got it. So our mission for you, the listener, today is to really get a handle on how these five perspectives, classic American liberalism, progressivism, post-liberalism, libertarianism, and woke leftism, how they each look at key historical moments and concepts.
Yeah, big ones too. The defeat of totalitarianism, the role of global institutions.
Right, the rise of neoconservatism, all those debates about interventionism, the founding of Israel, even the really difficult question of anti-Semitism.
It's a lot to cover.
It is, but it gets really interesting when you see the internal logic of each viewpoint,
Definitely. So should we start with the post-war liberal order itself? What was it?
Good place to start.
Okay. So this order, it basically emerges right after World War II. And the big goal, the driving force, was to prevent future global conflict.
Makes sense after what the world had just been through.
Exactly. The idea was to set up a system built on liberal democracy, economic openness, think free trade, human rights, and a new kind of international stability. And crucially, it was largely led, or at least underwritten, by the United States.
And you saw this reflected in specific institutions, right? Things we still talk about constantly.
Absolutely. The UN is the big one, of course, NATO for security.
Bretton Woods for the economic side, the World Bank, the IMF.
Precisely. It was this really interesting blend of moral idealism, this hope for a better, more peaceful world, but also strategic pragmatism.
Pragmatism, meaning?
Meaning it recognized power dynamics. It put the U.S. in this unique spot, both a major global power and sort of the arbiter of these new international norms.
Okay, and what's really fascinating, as you said, is how these five worldviews we're tracking interpret this whole setup. It's like looking at the same thing through totally different glasses.
Exactly. Let's take classic American liberalism first. Generally, it supports the post-war order, but, and this is key with caveats, big ones.
Like what?
Well, because it's grounded in that common sense realism and natural law, it insists the order must respect national sovereignty. It has to respect moral law, natural rights.
So it likes the idea of containing tyranny.
Yes, definitely values containing tyranny. But it's very wary. It warns against drifting into some kind of utopian globalism that ignores those fundamental objective principles, the rights of nations, the moral reality.
Okay, now progressivism seems like they'd be more enthusiastic.
Oh, completely. They fully embrace it. For progressives, this is a forward-looking project. It's a massive opportunity for international governance, for technocratic planning on a global scale, for, moral progress across humanity.
So they see it as a real win.
A moral triumph, yeah. Reason over barbarism.
Yeah.
A decisive step forward for civilization, in their view.
Then there's post-liberalism. I suspect they have a different take.
A very different take. They look at the post-war liberal order with deep skepticism, profound skepticism, really.
Why? What's their core critique?
They see it as basically an instrument of secular modernity, promoting this very narrow, very materialist kind of politics.
Okay.
And from their perspective, this whole system sidelined traditional societies. It pushed aside non-Western, non-liberal ways of governing things like, say, integralist systems where religion and state are linked, or just distinct civilizational or religious orders, all in favor of this one-size-fits-all liberal model.
Got it. Now, shifting again, libertarianism, what's their angle on this post-war order?
Well, their critique focuses squarely on state power. They see the order as empowering states, subsidizing militarism around the globe, and centralizing economic and political power internationally.
So things like NATO, the UN.
They're deeply suspicious. They fundamentally oppose what they call global policing. They see most international institutions as inherently coercive, basically infringing on individual freedom and national liberty.
Okay. And the last one, woke leftism. How do they interpret this period?
They often reinterpret the whole post-war order as essentially a mask a cover for ongoing colonialism and systemic oppression.
Even things like promoting democracy or human rights.
Their core idea is that even structures that look benevolent can actually just perpetuate existing power imbalances. So they condemn the order for entrenching Western dominance, especially through military power and corporate influence, not liberating, but actually perpetuating historical inequalities.
Wow, okay, that's a really stark range of views just on the basic framework. It really sets the stage, doesn't it? It does. So let's move to another key moment, dealing with totalitarianism, communism and fascism. How did these worldviews approach their defeat? Let's start with classic American liberalism again.
Okay. Classic American liberalism strongly supported containing both communism and fascism. And crucially, it wasn't just about geopolitics.
Not just about power politics, no.
For this framework, both ideologies were fundamentally flawed because they denied the objective moral order. They denied the natural rights of human beings. They were seen as philosophical evils, really, not just political opponents.
Right. What about progressivism? How did they frame, say, the Cold War?
Progressivism tended to frame the Cold War as this grand struggle. Rational democracy versus authoritarianism.
The battle of ideas.
Exactly. And they saw it as this huge opportunity to promote liberal modernity across the globe, to push for a world shaped by democratic ideals, enlightened governance, often through international cooperation.
Okay. Now, post-liberalism. Fascism and communism were defeated, but I get the sense they weren't entirely happy with what came next.
That's often the case. There's a critique within post-liberalism that Cold War liberalism, while defeating those threats, failed to preserve cultural rootedness.
Right.
There's often a resentment that traditionalist views, religious worldviews, were sort of swept aside, replaced by this new managerial, technocratic consensus that they feel devalued older ways of life, community bonds, that sort of thing.
Interesting. Libertarianism, they obviously oppose totalitarianism, but what about the methods used, like the Cold War itself?
Right. While they unequivocally rejected both communism and fascism, libertarians consistently questioned whether U.S. involvement abroad on that scale was justifiable.
The whole Cold War apparatus.
Yes. Their core belief is that defending liberty at home just isn't compatible with having an empire abroad. Intervention almost always leads to a loss of liberty, in their view. Too much state power.
And woke leftism. How do they read this history?
Often there's a tendency to significantly downplay the abuses under communist regimes. Yeah, and they frequently reframe Cold War history itself. Not as a necessary defense of freedom, but more as Western imperialist aggression, part of a larger power grab.
And fascism.
From this perspective, fascism is often seen less as this unique standalone evil and more as a symptom, maybe an extreme version, of existing Western hierarchies and power structures.
Yeah.
Capitalism, colonialism, etc.
Okay, that's quite a different interpretation.
It is. Now, this leads us naturally into talking about neoconservatism.
Right. A really influential movement, especially in the later 20th and early 21st century.
Definitely. It emerged mid-century, largely as a reaction. A reaction to totalitarianism, yes, but also to what they saw as liberal complacency, maybe even weakness.
And it had some surprising origins, didn't it?
It did. It's fascinating. Many of the early influential neoconservatives were actually former Trotskyites. They'd shifted hard right.
From world revolution to what?
To the conviction that American power and liberal democracy needed to be assertively promoted, even exported. It suggests that kind of intense ideological drive can just find new channels, right?
Yeah. And the movement really pushed for assertive American leadership, military strength, and actively exporting democracy, sometimes through intervention, even regime change.
We saw the peak of that under George W. Bush, obviously.
For sure. So the big question, how do our different frameworks view neoconservatism, classic American liberalism?
Well, classic American liberalism is pretty split here. On the one hand, it values the moral clarity, the defense of freedom that neoconservatism sometimes represented, but it's also critical of the perceived hubris, the sort of messianic quality, especially when neoconservative policies seem to undermine constitutional limits or the idea of self-government, both at home and abroad. There's that tension again between action and prudence.
Okay. Progressivism. What's the relationship with neoconservatism?
In recent decades, mostly opposition. They tend to see it as militaristic, overly nationalistic, reactionary, essentially.
Though you could argue some earlier progressives had similar interventionist ideals.
Absolutely. Under different labels, maybe liberal internationalism or something, But the idea of using American power to shape the world for the better has progressive roots, too. It's complicated.
Right. Post-liberalism, I imagine they're not fans.
Generally, no.
Hmm.
They often see neoconservatism as, quote, the final form of Enlightenment imperialism.
Wow. What does that mean?
They view it as this secular missionary movement trying to impose liberal values on traditional societies. And they believe this destroys local orders, customs, erodes those distinct cultural identities, the ethnos.
And libertarians, I think I can guess this one.
Fierce opposition. For libertarians, neoconservatism is the ideology of empire. Centralized power, endless war, the growth of the national security state, everything they stand against.
It's the antithesis of their philosophy.
Pretty much. And finally, woke leftism. They frequently see neoconservatism as just another extension of white supremacy and Western colonialism.
So even the democracy promotion aspect is suspect.
Exactly. From this perspective, democracy promotion is often viewed as merely a tool of oppression, a way to maintain global power structures, not genuinely liberate anyone.
It really shows how differently these groups interpret motivation and outcomes. Okay, let's broaden out a bit and talk about globalism itself. This idea that national borders should maybe become less important, yielding to international governance, markets, this sense of shared humanity.
The powerful idea, definitely. And it evokes really strong different reactions. Classic American liberalism.
Where do they land?
They support limited prudential cooperation between sovereign nations. Think treaties, alliances, where there's a clear mutual benefit.
But not world government.
Definitely not. They strongly reject what they'd call global technocracy, any system that overrides national self-determination or moral self-determination based on natural law. It's a very clear line. Cooperation, yes. Supranational authority that undermines sovereignty, no.
Okay. Progressivism, though, sounds like their cup of tea.
It really is. They tend to embrace institutional globalism. They genuinely believe that world governance, international law, international organizations, these are essential tools.
Tools for what?
For progress, for achieving equality globally, for fostering peace. They see it as the natural, positive evolution towards a more harmonious, just world order where collective action solves global problems like climate change or pandemics.
Makes sense. Post-liberalism, I'm guessing they see downsides?
Big time. They view globalism as culturally corrosive.
Corrosive, how?
They argue it's a system that actively dissolves the fundamental bonds, things like religion, family, shared ethnic or cultural identity, the ethnos. It replaces these deep roots, they'd say, with a shallow consumer identity and bureaucratic control from distant elites. It homogenizes everything.
Right, it strips away uniqueness, libertarianism. They like free markets, but global governance.
Exactly. Their critique is often on both economic and sovereignty grounds. Global trade, great, usually. Free movement of capital and goods, often yes. But global government, absolutely not.
Same objection as with the post-war order institutions.
Pretty much. They see global governance structures as a massive threat to both national autonomy and individual liberty. Just another layer of state power to resist.
And woke leftism. How does globalism fit into their framework?
They tend to promote a kind of borderless globalism, but one specifically aimed at dismantling systems of oppression.
So not just economic globalism.
No, it's more about solidarity across borders to fight perceived injustices. They often frame nationalism itself as inherently racist or problematic, and they support transnational policies focused on equity and inclusion worldwide. National boundaries are seen as obstacles to achieving global justice.
That's a really clear set of distinctions. Okay, this leads us right into the practical question of intervention. Interventionism, non-interventionism, maybe even isolationism. How do these frameworks approach the use of force or influence abroad?
A fundamental question, right? Classic American liberalism, again, aims for a middle ground. Principled intervention.
Principled meaning.
Meaning acting when it's deemed necessary to defend natural rights or the moral order. But, and this is crucial, always restrained by law, by prudence, by just war principles. It's not intervention for intervention's sake, but a considered approach rooted in a just cause and proportionality.
Okay. Progressivism. Seems like they might lean more towards intervention.
Often, yes. They tend to favor intervention framed as a humanitarian moral duty. There's a strong impulse towards liberal interventionism, especially when justified in the name of human rights.
And they prefer acting through
International institutions, usually.
Yeah.
The UN, regional bodies. It aligns with their belief in global governance. It's about a global responsibility to protect, R2P, that kind of thinking. Universal human rights are seen as trumping sovereignty in many cases.
Right. Post-liberalism, this sounds like another area where they might split.
They definitely do. Some post-liberal factions advocate for a hard-nosed strategic realism. Strong statecraft, focus on national interest, power projection to secure the nation's place in the world.
But others?
Others lean more towards a kind of civilizational isolationism. The idea being that pulling back is the best way to preserve the nation's unique character, its religious heritage, from what they see as corrupting external influences, especially liberal ones.
Huh? Okay. Libertarianism. Pretty clear stance here, I assume?
Very clear. They lean hard into non-interventionism. The default position is that war is almost always unjustified unless it's in direct self-defense, right at your borders.
Anything else's?
Imperial overreach, a drain on resources, a threat to liberty at home because war inevitably grows the state. It's seen as fundamentally incompatible with their core principles.
Makes sense. Woke leftism. How do they view Western intervention?
Primarily as neocolonialism. They are highly skeptical of military action by Western powers, seeing it as just perpetuating global hierarchies and power imbalances.
But are there exceptions?
Potentially. They might support interventions if they are very specifically framed as liberating the oppressed from a non-Western power, perhaps. But it's a very high bar, and there's often internal debate. The default is strong anti-interventionism regarding the West.
Okay, now let's tackle a really specific and often very contentious issue. The establishment of Israel. You said this is uniquely revealing.
It really is. It touches on so many core tenets. Nationalism, self-determination, religion, colonialism, power politics, classic American liberalism.
How did they view it, generally?
Generally supportive. They tended to see Israel as a legitimate democratic state, founded on principles aligned with Western legal norms, a respect for human dignity, a homeland for a people with ancient roots seeking self-determination after persecution.
What with caveats again?
Yes. While supporting Israel's right to exist securely, classic American liberalism, rooted in moral realism, would also caution against uncritical support. It would emphasize the need for justice and restraint regarding all parties in the conflict, including Palestinians.
Okay. Progressivism. Has their view changed over time?
Dramatically. There was a time when many progressives viewed Israel quite positively, perhaps as a social democratic, even socialist experiment, a pioneering nation.
But now...
Now, the dominant view within progressivism is increasingly critical. Israel is frequently framed as a settler colonial state, and the focus is overwhelmingly on the perception of Palestinian oppression.
Right. Post-liberalism. You mentioned they split on things.
They split here, too, quite significantly. Some post-liberals actually support the idea of ethno-national states like Israel. They see it as a natural political community, reflecting their own desire for distinct cultural and national identities and the right of a people to self-govern in their homeland.
But the other side.
Others within post-liberalism are deeply suspicious of Zionism. Sometimes this connects to broader skepticism about global finance or influence, which can, unfortunately, sometimes veer into conspiratorial thinking or rhetoric that echoes older anti-Semitic tropes about Jewish power. It's a complex and sometimes troubling area.
Okay. Libertarianism. How does their state skepticism play out here?
Predictably. They tend to view the founding of Israel, like the founding of many states, through their lens of state skepticism. Because they view the state itself as often coercive, Israel's creation, especially with significant early support and ongoing military aid from powers like the U.S., is often seen less as a moral necessity or act of self-determination and more as a geopolitical artifact, an act of state power, essentially.
Got it. And woke leftism.
The view here is overwhelmingly critical. Israel is predominantly seen as a colonial oppressor.
Reducing the complexity?
Often, yes. There's a strong tendency to reduce the entire conflict to a simple binary, oppressor versus oppressed. This leads to strong alignment with anti-Zionist positions in movements like BDS boycott, divestment, sanctions. The whole situation is interpreted primarily through a post-colonial framework.
That issue definitely highlights the divides. Okay, finally, let's touch on something related and deeply troubling. Anti-Semitism. It's an ugly reality, sadly present across different ideologies. How does each framework respond?
It's crucial to look at this classic American liberalism.
Your stance.
Unequivocal condemnation. Because it's grounded in natural law and moral equality, it affirms religious liberty and the absolute necessity of protecting minorities. Anti-Semitism is seen as a fundamental violation of human dignity, full stop.
Progressivism.
They certainly claim to oppose anti-Semitism. However, there's a recurring issue where anti-Semitism is sometimes tolerated or excused when it's disguised as anti-Zionism.
That line gets blurred.
It can. Within certain intersectional coalitions on the left, Sometimes anti-Semitic rhetoric or tropes get a pass if they align with broader critiques of power, Israel, or perceived Western influence. There's a tension there.
Post-liberalism, you mentioned it's a mixed bag.
It really is. Some factions, especially those drawing on certain more extreme Christian traditionalist ideas or figures like Julius Evola, who pushed ethnic essentialism, well, they can definitely blur the line between cultural criticism and actual anti-Semitism.
But not all post-liberals.
No, definitely not. Others condemn anti-Semitism outright. But even then, their emphasis on a world of distinct ethnos and civilizational boundaries can sometimes create friction or suspicion towards groups perceived as transnational or cosmopolitan, which historically included Jews.
Okay. Libertarianism, they focus on individual liberty, so.
You'd think it would be straightforward. But regrettably, some fringe circles within libertarianism have shown susceptibility to conspiratorial forms of anti-Semitism.
How does that happen?
Sometimes the intense distrust of centralized power, especially banking and global finance, can unfortunately morph into scapegoating. And historically, Jews have tragically been central figures in those kinds of conspiracy theories about elite control.
Right. And woke leftism.
They strongly oppose what they clearly identify as right-wing anti-Semitism, like neo-Nazism. However, they often struggle to police anti-Semitism within their own ranks. When Jews are perceived, rightly or wrongly, as being part of the oppressor group, maybe due to socioeconomic status in the West, or perceived alignment with Israel, anti-Semitism can get repackaged. It's relabeled as decolonial critique or criticism of privilege. This allows certain forms of prejudice to persist, often unchallenged, because it fits the broader framework of oppressor-oppressed.
That's a really sobering overview of a persistent problem. Okay, as we wrap up this deep dive, let's circle back to the big question we started with. Which of these frameworks, in your view, best preserves the American telos, its ultimate purpose or destiny?
It's the crucial question, isn't it? And if you look at the whole picture we've painted, connecting it back to those foundational principles, well, this seems pretty clear that only classic American liberalism consistently aims to defend ordered liberty.
Ordered liberty.
Meaning liberty that's grounded in moral realism, in objective natural rights, and that requires civic virtue to sustain itself. It's the framework that explicitly tries to balance freedom with responsibility, warning against both the tyranny of empire and the chaos of anarchy that dissolves necessary social bonds.
But the other frameworks, they do offer something, right? They tap into real concerns.
Absolutely. They offer partial truths, you could say. Progressivism rightly emphasizes planning and collective action to address inequality. Post-liberalism correctly identifies the hunger for meaning, for a sacred or rooted order in an often rootless modern world. Libertarianism is an essential guard dog for individual freedom against state encroachment. And woke leftism forces a necessary confrontation with historical injustices and demands a deeper commitment to true justice for the marginalized.
What?
But the key takeaway, I think, is that none of these other frameworks, when taken in isolation, seem to consistently preserve liberty with virtue in the way America's foundational principles intended. They often sacrifice one for the other.
So that leaves a challenge for the listener, doesn't it?
It really does. A final thought for you to consider. In this incredibly complex, interconnected world we live in now, how do you navigate these powerful, competing visions? How do we collectively forge a future that successfully balances that precious individual liberty with the genuine common good?
And how do we do that while staying true to those foundational principles we've been discussing?
Exactly. It's not easy. It requires ongoing deep thinking, constant engagement with these ideas. It's a conversation that has to continue.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for joining us on this very deep dive today. Lots to think about. Keep exploring these crucial ideas.